In the middle of the 14th century, one of the most devastating events in human history wiped out half the population of Europe. But as we've seen, the most likely cause of this pandemic, the bubonic plague, caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, started in Asia and then made its way west, south, northwest, and then looped back around east, tightening around the medieval European world like a noose. So how exactly did the plague move from Asia into Europe? Well, we can answer that question in a general sense. It came along the trade routes. But in this lecture, we're going to get really specific. How did it first make contact with the European world? Using the first-person accounts of medieval people and some modern-day detective work, we'll get pretty close to having an answer, I think. When we think of the words trade and medieval Europe, it's usually one group of people who come to mind first: the Italians. The Italian peninsula, in its prime position, extending down into the Mediterranean and connected to the European landmass, had been a center of trade for centuries, and Italian merchants and sailors had gotten pretty good at moving goods and services among Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Western Europe. It's important to clarify here, however, that it's not really correct to refer to these people as Italians. Italy was far from unified at this point in time, and in effect, it was a collection of city-states, each fiercely independent and with its own self-contained government, guild system, military, and economic interests. Florentines considered themselves different from Venetians, who were definitely different from Neapolitans, who were not the same as the Milanese. And Sicilians were their own thing altogether, at an even farther remove. In the year 1266, a group of Genoese traders and merchants established a center of trade at a place called Caffa, which today is called Feodosia. This port city is on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. In order to set up a trading center there, the Genoese had to enter into an agreement with the ruling people of that area, the Tatars, also called Mongols, also called the Golden Horde. If you look at a map of routes of Italian ships of this time, you can see why this stronghold was so critical to lucrative trading. From the Italian peninsula, Genoese and other merchants would move from the Mediterranean into the Aegean Sea, and from there through the Dardanelles into the Sea of Marmara, then through the Bosporus into the Black Sea, where they could put in at Caffa. From there, they could move into the Sea of Azov, and the Genoese had also established an outpost in the northeast corner of the Sea of Azov, at a place that was then called Tana. From Tana, they could extend their trade route both overland into the Middle East and along the Don River into Russia. It was an extensive and profitable network, but relations between the Mongols and the traders were often tense. To give you an idea of how tense, in 1307, Toktai Khan arrested most of the Italian traders who were then in the Mongol capital of Sarai, and then he laid siege to Caffa. He was upset because Genoese merchants had cornered the market on Turkish slaves, and they were selling these slaves to the Mamluk Sultanate, who would then train them to be soldiers, and those soldiers would fight in the Sultanate's interests against the Golden Horde. Everybody got that? What's important to know is there's a conflict between the Mongols and the Genoese. In any event, after initially resisting the Mongol siege, the Genoese decided to call it quits, which they could easily do. The siege was coming from land, and there was no blockade in the harbor, so they could leave by water. But before they left, in an act of defiance, they set the whole city of Caffa on fire. A few years later, Toktai died, and his successor, Özbeg, invited the Genoese back, recognizing that there was profit to be had from their relationship. It was Özbeg who gave them control of Tana, which allowed the Genoese to expand their trade network. This, in turn, made them ever more eager to keep a firm hold on Caffa. By the 1340s, Caffa was both thriving and heavily fortified. It had 2 concentric walls of protection, and it's estimated that within the inner walls were about 6,000 households, and within the outer walls, about 11,000. It was a very cosmopolitan population, including people who identified themselves as Greeks, Turks, Venetians, Armenians, Jews, and Mongols. Now, in 1343, there was what amounts to a street fight between some of the Italian population of Tana and some of the Muslim population. Instead of dissipating, the violence escalated, and the forces of the new Mongol leader, Yanibeg, tried to arrest the Genoese who were involved. They, in turn, hopped in their boats and fled south and west across the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea and took refuge in Caffa. Further escalating the conflict, Yanibeg decided to attack the city, and he laid siege to it off and on for 2 whole years. One reason the conflict lasted so long was due to the significant defenses presented by those concentric walls that I mentioned a moment ago. The other was that while Yanibeg pretty much ensured there was no movement in or out of the city by land, the Genoese, once again, and the other inhabitants, were still able to come and go and get supplies in a limited fashion by sea. This situation might have continued pretty much indefinitely, one supposes, were it not for something totally unexpected. In 1345, Yanibeg's forces were ravaged by plague, which had started to make its way west. The Mongol forces recognized that they were defeated and that the siege was over, but before they withdrew, they engaged in what microbiologist Mark Wheelis has described as, quote, the most spectacular incident of biological warfare ever. They loaded up their trebuchets with plague corpses and launched them into the city. It is this event that many contemporary chroniclers identify as the first contact between the European world and the plague. It's this belief that informs the first-person account of one Gabriele de Mussi, who wrote one of the first accounts of the plague's arrival in Europe. He wrote in Latin, in a text that has come to be called the Historia de Morbo, and it's clear that he undertook this task as a very serious attempt to record history and leave a formal account for posterity. De Mussi was a lawyer in the Italian town of Piacenza, which was itself hard hit by the plague. He begins his account by reminding readers of the vengeance and punishments of God, stating that God had warned Christians to give up their sinning ways, and because they did not listen, the Lord then sent the plague as punishment. Now, this was a widespread belief in the medieval world, as one might expect. Here, in Rosemary Horrocks' excellent translation from the Latin, is a key passage to which historians, scientists, medical professionals, and literary scholars alike have turned again and again over the years in an attempt to understand the nature of the plague. Here's what de Mussi wrote, quote, "O God, see how the heathen Tartar races, pouring together from all sides, suddenly infested the city of Caffa and besieged the trapped Christians there for almost 3 years. But behold, the whole army was affected by a disease which overran the Tartars and killed thousands upon thousands every day. All medical advice and attention was useless. The Tartars died as soon as the signs of disease appeared on their bodies. Swellings in the armpit or groin caused by coagulating humors, followed by a putrid fever." End quote. Now, as you might guess, the thing that interests scholars here is the very specific reference to buboes appearing in those infected. This seems pretty clearly to be a case of bubonic plague. Indeed, you might actually call it a textbook description. Now, some have questioned why, if plague is spread by rat fleas and the army was infected, those in the city didn't also get infected. Rats are pretty famous for being able to get in and out of places people usually can't move between themselves. But remember, the Mongol army was not right up against the city wall. During a siege, you don't want to make yourself vulnerable to things being dropped on you from above, like rocks or maybe some boiling oil. So if you're laying siege to a city, your encampment is probably at least a good half-mile or so away. In the case of Caffa, it's too far for the rat population of the army to travel and get into the city. Demusy continues his account, quote, "The dying Tartars, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, lost interest in the siege. But they ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could in the sea. And soon, the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Moreover, one infected man could carry the poison to others and infect people and places with the disease by look alone," end quote. Now, obviously, to a modern and scientifically trained mind, there's a bit of hyperbole happening here, but only in the statement that the disease could be passed, quote, "by look alone." The claim about mountains of dead and thousands of corpses may actually be more or less correct, given what we can surmise about the size of Yani Beg's army and the mortality rates associated with plague. And the description of the transmission of the illness to people in the city may also be correct. Even if there were no fleas on these corpses, and there likely were fleas on many of them, but even if there weren't any fleas, most of the bodies probably had open wounds, either from warfare or from attempts to lance the buboes, expelling the foul humors in an effort to effect a cure. Now, those in the city may also have had open wounds. Certainly, there are going to be some cuts and scrapes, especially if there's a need for a large contingent of people to drag catapulted corpses to the sea and try to dispose of them. This open wound contact may indeed have caused infection in Caffa. As you might imagine, there were plenty of people who said that plague-infected corpses being used as weapons was simply the last straw, and the survivors started leaving the city by sea and returning to their hometowns. Demusy relates that when the sailors reached their respective hometowns, quote, "It was as if they had brought evil spirits with them. Every city, every settlement, every place was poisoned by the contagious pestilence. And when one person had contracted the illness, he poisoned his whole family, even as he fell and died, so that those preparing to bury his body were seized by death in the same way," end quote. Demusy then returns to his vengeance of God theme. Quote, "We Genoese and Venetians bear the responsibility for revealing the judgments of God. Because we had been delayed by tragic events, and because among us were scarcely 10 survivors from 1,000 sailors, relations, kinsmen, and neighbors flocked to us from all sides. But to our anguish, we were carrying the darts of death. While they hugged and kissed us, we were spreading poison from our lips, even as we spoke," end quote. Now, this passage has long interested scholars who've been intrigued by the fact that it sounds like Demusy himself was one of those refugees from Caffa who fled at the end of the siege. And assuming this is the case, his account has even more significance than at first appreciated. However, most scholars today believe that Demusy was actually in Piacenza the whole time, and that here what he's doing is writing in something like a spirit of fellowship with his countrymen, and also as one overwhelmed by the enormity of this catastrophe. But at the same time, scholars are also very grateful for the level of detail Demusy offers, even going so far as to identify by name the man who let patient zero into Piacenza. This man is Fulco della Croce, who took in an ill sailor friend of his who had just arrived from Caffa. Now, poor Fulco probably never imagined the place he would someday hold in the historical record as the guy who, by giving hospitality to a friend, doomed first himself, then his family, then all of Piacenza, and arguably the rest of Italy, to the ravages of the plague. Debussy goes on to give several poignant descriptions of what life has been like in the city up to the time of his account. He talks about mass graves dug in colonnades and piazzas because there's no more burial room in the graveyards left. He talks about sick people abandoned by terrified family members, priests who are afraid to administer last rites, healthy people recognizing that there's no defense and making plans for their own deaths. And he talks also about the renewed turn to faith and prayers offered to particular intercessory saints. Many of these saints had languished in obscurity for some time, but now, all of a sudden, they were very much back in vogue. In a later lecture, we'll talk more about what it took to become a plague saint. And yes, there are some unique qualifications needed, but for now, it's sufficient to know that things in Piacenza and most of the rest of Italy looked pretty grim. Without a doubt, the Siege of Caffa is a stunning story, and as Professor Wheelis says, quote, the most spectacular incident of biological warfare ever, end quote. But at the same time, it's unlikely that this event was the sole means by which plague made its way into Western Europe. Also, we have to remember that because there was no real understanding of germ transmission or the mechanism of infection, Yianni Beg was probably trying to inflict more psychological than physical harm on the people inside the walls of the besieged city of Caffa. At best, Yianni Beg might have been hoping to sicken and demoralize the citizens by causing a miasma to infect the city. This word miasma was a medieval sort of catch-all term to explain modes of infection, and it was believed that foul smells, like those emitted by corpses, could cause illness among a population. Wheelis certainly thinks infection by catapult corpse was possible, and it was possible and likely, too, that at least some of the refugees from Caffa brought the plague with them when they fled. However, Norwegian historian Ole Jørgen Benediktov, one of the foremost authorities on the Black Death, feels that this form of transmission is actually unlikely. He believes that eventually the rodent population of the Mongol army somehow made it into Caffa along with their fleas, and that's what caused the outbreak. Still, all scholars agree that Caffa was, at the very least, one of the first places that medieval Europeans had contact with what would become the Great Pestilence. In any event, it's also pretty clear that the Black Death was coming into the medieval world by a variety of routes. Certainly, given the multiple trade routes that radiated out from it overland and by sea, the Italian peninsula was ground zero for infection. But it's not the case that Italy would have avoided plague if Yianni Beg had opted to burn his dead rather than turn them into projectiles. There's no question, the plague was already raging in China, Russia, across the steppes of Asia Minor, and it was only a matter of when, not if, the Black Death would rear its head in the medieval European world. But Caffa makes a great story, and Demousy's account is fascinating and moving, and you just can't talk about the Black Death without spending a little time with the Historia de Morbo and the events it describes. Okay, so here's what we know so far. In 1346, plague activity was happening to the northwest of the Caspian Sea and the northeast of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. It struck Caffa, and then in 1347, the area around Constantinople was hit particularly hard. As Constantinople was a major center for trade throughout the West and the East, it's very likely that traders coming from this great city were unwittingly bringing plague with them, whichever direction they were heading. Sailors and merchants, primarily from the Italian peninsula, brought it into the European world. If you look at a map of the spread of the plague, you can see clearly how it struck port cities first, and then these sort of pockets of infection spread to the rest of the continent. So in 1347, the Black Death shows up on Crete, on Cyprus, in southern Greece, and in Alexandria in Egypt. A look at the map of Italy and modern-day Croatia reveals even more emphatically the multiple points of entry for plague into the medieval European world. Dubrovnik, Split, Venice, Sicily, Pisa, and Genoa all were infected in 1347, as were Marseille, Aix-en-Provence, and Avignon in France, also Majorca off the coast of Spain. In 1348, the plague then spread inland from these initial entry points, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, when you look at the map of these trade routes, a logical question to ask is how an infected ship's crew could survive such a long journey from Caffa all the way to Genoa without everybody succumbing to the plague and being unable to continue. Our best guess here is that the ships in question had a large and diverse group of people on board. Not just the oarsmen and sailors, but also military troops whose job it was to protect the precious goods being transported from piracy and theft. The numbers must have been high enough that the infection couldn't make its way through everyone all that quickly. And if we're talking the bubonic form of plague, there could be survivors. As you'll remember from an earlier lecture, the bubonic form seems to be the one form of plague from which someone might recover, with survival rates around 18 to 20%. Also, while the sea routes look really long, we have to remember the ratio for medieval travel: 1, 7, 23. What this means is that if it took you 23 days to get somewhere on foot, it would take you 7 days to go the same distance on horseback, and just 1 day to cover that same distance by sea. And the distance from Genoa to Caffa is 2,160 nautical miles. If we assume a conservative speed of 5 knots, then it would take about 18 days to make the trip between the two. More time, obviously, if there was bad weather or if they were stopping in various ports to offload and take on more cargo. But if sailing conditions were good, it might be possible to do it even more quickly. And if we're assuming that the refugees from Caffa were in a hurry to get home, then they probably could have made it much more quickly. The trip from plague-infested Constantinople would have taken even less time, under 2 weeks in good conditions. So the plague may not have had enough time to fully work its way through the crew of a ship, and some sailors, indeed, may have been just starting to show signs of illness when they made landfall, prompting them to seek out treatment and hospitality from the closest friend or acquaintance they could find, like the poor, hapless Folco della Croce. As the plague made its first significant European incursion into Italy, it's no surprise that it was Italian writers, like Gabriele de' Mussi, who were the first to chronicle its progression. A middle-class Florentine named Giovanni Villani discussed the Black Death's appearance in his history, which is called the Nuova Cronica. The difference between de' Mussi and Villani is that, while the former was inspired to take up his pen because of the Black Death, the latter was already writing a history when the Black Death began to sweep across the Italian peninsula, and he included this in his account of the progression of historical events. Villani was inspired to write a history of Florence on the occasion of the Jubilee in Rome in the year 1300, on which occasion Pope Boniface VIII issued a huge number of papal indulgences in honor of Christ's nativity. Villani relates that on this occasion, it occurred to him that Rome seemed to be in decline, while the fortunes of Florence were rising. Remember, there's nothing at all like a unified Italy at this time. It's all individual, independent city-estates. And he thought that someone ought to write a history of Florence, since one didn't exist. And he thought that he should be the someone to do it. There are a lot of things that are fascinating and important about this work, not least of which is that Villani chose to write in the vernacular Florentine tongue, the language of Dante, and what would become the basis for modern Standard Italian. And he gave accounts of events that had affected Florence, but that seemed to go far beyond his primary subject. For example, historians agree that Villani's description of the Battle of Crécy in the Hundred Years' War between France and England is one of the most accurate accounts of that conflict. What's really amazing about this work, however, is the level of detail and the amount of data Villani gave. When recording events of Florentine history, he always lists names of people, streets, piazzas, bridges, and buildings in great detail. He provides tons of statistical data that might not have otherwise been available to historians. That, for example, Florence had 80 banks, 146 bakeries, up to 10,000 children attending primary school in any given year. He tells his readers how many pieces of cloth were produced by the arte della lana, or wool makers, a trade in which he had a vested interest, as he was a member of the Wool Finishers Guild, a banker and a minor politician who stood to profit from the production of wool in Florence. And in case you're wondering, the production was around 75,000 pieces of cloth per year. As a statesman and diplomat, Villani traveled far beyond the walls of the city, at one point negotiating the importation of grain into Florence during a famine in 1329. He also was one of the supervisors of the construction of Andrea Pisano's bronze doors for the Florentine baptistry. These are the bronze relief quatrefoil frames that would be so spectacularly exceeded and replaced by Ghiberti's famous Gates of Paradise. And from the year 1300 on, Villani was discussing these and other events in his Nuova Cronica. In late 1347 and early 1348, he turned his attention to the Black Death, which had appeared in Italy's major port cities around September and October of 1347, and which was in full force by December. His chronicle ends with the following paragraph. Quote, "Having grown in vigor in Turkey and Greece, and having spread thence over the whole Levant and Mesopotamia and Syria and Chaldea and Cyprus and Rhodes and all the islands of the Greek archipelago, the said pestilence leaped to Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and Elba, and from there soon reached all the shores of the mainland, and many lands and cities were made desolate, and the plague lasted till..." And there it stops. Seriously, Villani left a blank space, clearly planning to fill in the end date of the Great Mortality. But he himself died of plague in 1348, and so the chronicle remains incomplete. Villani's brother Matteo went on to add accounts of events to the Chronica until he himself died in 1363, also from plague. After that, Villani's nephew Filippo briefly continued the work. In a later lecture, when we take an in-depth look at the case of Florence and the Black Death, we'll return to the Chronica and other sources that describe how life was changed in that city. But for now, it's sufficient to understand that at the end of 1347, people living on the Italian peninsula were starting to recognize that this pestilence was not going to burn itself out quickly, and it was not going to remain contained or limited to port cities. The example of the island of Sicily made this clear. The plague arrived there when Genoese sailors docked in the port city of Messina in October of 1347. By the end of the year, the whole island was ravaged when citizens of Messina fled into the Sicilian interior to escape the plague. All they did was bring it with them and spread it more quickly. The same thing happened in Pisa, which was the main port by which Tuscany accessed the Mediterranean and its trade routes. So we see that the first wave of the plague struck Italy particularly hard, but what seemed like the end of days was only the beginning of horrors that would last for at least a generation. In this very first wave, the French port of Marseille was also struck. It's important to recognize this in order to understand how the Black Death continued its march through the medieval world in 1347. Marseille was the gateway to France for the plague, and from there to England, where the great mortality struck with astonishing virulence. Since Marseille was an important trading hub in terms of both sea and land routes, the arrival of the Black Death there in 1347 gave the disease an advantageous position from which to advance across Western Europe. Had Marseille avoided such an early exposure to the plague, it's possible that the great mortality's advance might have been slowed somewhat, as news from Italy might have reached the westernmost points of medieval Europe a little sooner and allowed some countermeasures to take effect. But because Marseille was affected around the same time as the port cities of Italy, the Black Death gained a foothold and was raging across the landscape before people really understood what was happening. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about this first incursion of plague and the responses of those who encountered it.